Namaste and in La Catch, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and this week's guest is Christopher Smith. He is a physician, an investor, a blogger. He's a former homeless person, and we'll be talking about that, I'm sure. He's a public speaker. He's an Amazon bestseller with his book, Homeless to Hopkins. And the children's version of it just came out, so you might want to check that out as well. And he's working on a new book called Overcoming Adversity, and you can imagine what that's going to be like just by the title. He's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University and School of Medicine. He's a physician, diagnostic radiologist, and quantum imaging and therapeutic for the Therapeutic Associates. And Christopher, wonderful.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
We're
glad to be here. Thank you.
I hope I did you justice.
It was great. Thank you.
Awesome. So, knowing this, the whole homeless to Hopkins theme, let's start a little earlier than that. And was there anything, as common with my guests, that kind of tuned you into something different as a child? That you saw the world a little differently than others around you?
Maybe the fact that I love to read. I love to acquire information. When I was a kid, I would actually read the encyclopedia for fun because I was so curious about the world around me. I literally tried to absorb as much information as possible. And so reading was always kind of my strength, and I loved reading everything. And I was a voracious reader. By the time I was in fifth grade, I was reading like above a 12th grade level because I read so much as a kid. And those stories were powerful for me.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And especially, and maybe you can help me out with this in your view of kids today. It seems like for some reason they've lost the curiosity of reading. They spend a lot of time in the video realm and cyberspace and playing games and things like that. Do you think, first of all, if you've noticed that there's a shift in that level of curiosity, how do you think, or what would you suggest might be a way of changing that a bit?
I think, well, for me, with my kids growing up, we didn't let them have TVs in the room, but we let them have books. They could have all the books they wanted to read in their room. And so growing up, they would always be reading to go to bed at night instead of watching a YouTube video or anything like that. So, and I used to take them to Salvation Army or the Goodwill because books are kind of cheap there. So I'd let them go there and they would pick 5 to 10 books, whatever books they wanted, and bring them home. Then when they're done, we take them back to the Salvation Army so they could sell them again.
Sure.
And encouraging them to read those books and create their imaginations was kind of key. And I used to also tell them stories rather than like watch videos. Like for bedtime, we would make up stories. Like they would help me make up the stories about to help them go to sleep. So we'd make up these wonderful, amazing stories, just having fun.
Sure.
And that was my goal, to encourage them to use their imaginations growing up. And I think as much as we encourage kids, I think the thing with reading is a lot of people don't think they like reading because they haven't found their niche, their genre they like to read. But there are so many genres that are so interesting, and encouraging those people to find those genres, I think, will draw them into the world of reading. It's my daughter actually works at Barnes and Noble now, as the bookstore, and she's saying how actually
funny coincidence, eh? Right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So she's seeing a lot more people actually coming in and getting books and things like that for the kids. I think COVID actually might have either encouraged people to read or watch more TV or Netflix or whatever. So I think just encouraging people to find their niche, the thing they like reading, whether it's fantasy versus, nonfiction, military history, whatever their history is. There are so many books that can interest people. They just need to read them. And once you start reading, you'll be like, wow, this is an amazing universe that's opened up to me that I didn't realize was there.
Right. And what's interesting, I think you and I are quite a bit alike in our desire to read and the visual creation that happens in the reading. It's like you go into other worlds, you can actually be there and be absorbed by it, and especially with good writers. And
exactly,
it's really a kind of devastating. As a high school teacher I was for a while, and that curiosity, it's hard to instill or inspire when that desire has not really been nurtured in their lives. And by the time kids get to high school, they really, it's hard to develop a curiosity at that point.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
now, as you moved forward in your own life and the curiosity that you had, did you begin to explore your inner develop, your own self-awareness and how you thought and felt about things and why?
Yeah, so growing up, my life was very turbulent growing up. And so my inner development actually, as a kid, I had to learn to kind of put those emotions away, kind of box them away because it was so the circumstance was so difficult and the fear, and we would move so much. I lost so many friends growing up. I'd have a friend and then we'd be moving without any notice. And so I really kind of boxed those feelings a lot inside until maybe 10 years ago, I started to kind of unbox that package. And that was actually part of the reason why I decided to write my book, as I was going through these memories and things, trying to come to an understanding of what was happening and why I went through that, and kind of um, confront those memories, those
Sure.
memories we lock away.
And
And
writing's so
that in
cathartic too. The writing is so cathartic. It gives you that opportunity to really self-examine as you're going through those experiences from a little bit of a distance, so that it's sometimes the sight's a little clearer.
It is, and you remember details. Once you start writing, you remember like little details of events that happen and things, and
Mhm.
feelings. The feelings are you get almost like an emotional memory that's there. You don't quite understand why it's there, but it's there in the back of your head, this emotional feeling. And when you're starting to write it down, you're like, okay, yeah, now I understand a little bit more about that emotion that I was feeling and understanding.
Now, do you find that articulating those, and I think this is just a phenomenal point of order in this conversation that's very apocalyptic, because we don't know how to express our emotions. We've never been taught how to interpret the senses that we have. We generally go to emotional responses, right? Which is how we think about how we feel. But the sensation in that feeling is how we, or so often ineffable in the moment as children, and we don't really understand how to process it until we get older. How did you find a way to process those things as the compartmentalization that you did? And I understand that, totally normal, right? We kind of push things out that we don't want to have, that just feel bad, first of all. So were there some things that you learned in the unpacking of that over time that helped you to look at the whys and better understand your own process and ability to navigate?
Yes, yes. Actually, my wife is she's very much in tune with her emotions. She almost has like an empathic type personality where she can understand and feel things and really understand emotions. So my wife has been very instrumental with for me, helping me to understand my emotions. She has this energy, this positive energy that kind of helps her to understand people and helps people understand. So you asked me about emotions and be able to kind of come to understand emotions. And my for me, one person that's been very helpful. Number one is I actually went to therapy for a couple of years. Kind of, if you have a lot of heavy weight and things like that, sometimes it's good to work it through with somebody who's a professional.
Absolutely.
And so that's one thing I did, and that was actually extremely helpful. But then also my wife. My wife has been very helpful for me because she's more of an emotional person. She's has more of that empathic type personality where she can sense and just feel things about people. It's a unique talent that she has, and be able to like understand their energies, their positive or negative energies, kind of just being able to understand that. And for me, my wife has been very helpful, helping me to kind of process emotion and understand emotion, because for her it's intuitive. For me, I have to have logic and try to understand it because I'm more of the intellectual type.
Sure,
And
sure.
and so going through writing my book and going through the process, I started to understand a lot more about those emotions and how emotions affect me physically and emotion and mentally, not just emotionally. And how it's good to actually confront and deal with those emotions. It's okay to cry once in a while. When you feel like you need to cry at something, it's okay to cry. It's taken me a long time to be able to understand that. And
Right. And as men, we are taught to be stalwart. Don't express, don't cry, don't show emotion. And yet we're so depleted because of that over time, because it's life. We feel just like women do. Shouldn't we be, not that we're shooting on ourselves, right?
yeah,
Shouldn't we be able to communicate how we feel and not be reticent of doing so? Of
we
course,
should
if
be
it's
able to. Yeah,
appropriately, right? We're not going to
yeah,
be
absolutely.
screaming and hollering. However, that gets us in touch with how we feel, and it's part of self-awareness, isn't it?
Exactly, absolutely. And also one other thing, I agree, it's we need to be more self-aware, especially as men, we tend to bottle those emotions up and now deal with them, which can affect us physically down the long run. They've actually done studies that long term you actually affects your physical health if you're not able to work through those emotions. Um, but one other thing that I've also found helpful for me is music. Music for me kind of
Mm.
touches my soul and kind of gives voice to emotions that I can't express verbally, but I can express it, feel through music. I can understand through music.
You play it all?
I didn't have the chance growing up because my life was so chaotic. But my daughters, all my daughters, they all play a couple instruments: piano, voice, and violin. And but just in general, music, listening to music or feeling music. I wish I played. I actually one of my goals eventually is to learn the guitar here when I get a little
Good for
time.
you. Good for you.
Um, but music, I think we all have this universal music's kind of universal language, and
It
I think
is.
part of it is, and I think part of it is because when we're babies in the womb or the uterus, we hear the heartbeat of our mothers for 9 months straight. And if you look at the beat of music, most popular music, the beat is very similar to a human heartbeat,
Mhm.
and so I think as we grow up, we hear that, and so music can touch our soul when we can't really express other ways to do it. It's hard to express those emotions, but a lot of time music is able to express and make people feel. And it doesn't matter the language. Like I listen to K-pop now and stuff like that. I still love it. I
Yeah,
like groups like BTS, and I don't quite obviously read the translations, but I can understand. I feel the music, and I can just
sure.
feel it.
My wife is a conservatory trained accompanist and music theory pedagogue from St. Petersburg, Russia.
Okay.
So
Oh,
she's gone through their rigors and is a consummate professional in how she plays, and she understands all of this, music. She says she speaks 4 languages. One of them is music. And to part of what they studied was not just the music, it was the composer, it was the time, it was the tone and voice of the time and the emotions in the music. And so there's this depth of understanding from the sensations of this music, and it takes us all kinds of different places in doing so. So those things and I'm just a drummer, right? So
just a drummer. Drummers are awesome. I love drumming.
thank
So
you, thank you. And I love to play, especially improv and fusion, progressive rock and jazz kind of stuff, to where it's just explosive and you just let go and play. And there's this jumping off into the void, not knowing where you're going to go, and yet you often have these wonderful conversations musically by doing so. It's just a
yeah.
phenomenal experience, much the same as what I believe you are saying, in just the feeling of the music and where it takes you and how it processes inside you.
Exactly. And so when I was a teenager, that was one of my escapes, was to listen to different types of music.
Hmm.
And all the a huge gamut from Broadway musicals all the way to stuff like Metallica, heavy metal, just a huge range,
Right.
just depends on the mood. So as a kid, you ask about emotions. That's one of the things actually I did to help process my emotions, was listen to music. So
Now, did you find yourself, when you're listening to music, were you conscious of how the music was taking or was it aiding and abetting your emotions?
I think it depended on the mood, but
Right,
yes.
right, right. So in that understanding, where did it go? How did you bring that into your experience? And before we go into that, there's the process that you went through going from homeless to Hopkins is excruciating and ecstatic, I'm sure. In those excruciating moments, I like to use the term excruciatingly fun because they're not so fun in the moment, but when you're looking back, you can kind of see the silliness sometimes of your behavior and your choices, right? So
Yeah.
in that excruciating part, what were kind of some of the things that you were dealing with and the process that you went through internally with that to move forward?
So there were many experiences growing up. Probably one of the most traumatic was my senior year of high school. We were homeless, and I slept in a car my entire senior year of high school. And it was in Utah, so they would get cold in winter. It would get
Hmm.
quite cold, as in like 20 degrees cold. And sometimes I'd wake up and my hair would actually be frozen. Back when I had more hair, my hair would be frozen, and because it was so cold.
You mean
And sometimes,
those days, huh? We did
yeah,
have that
exactly.
at one point, right?
Yeah, exactly. We did have hair at one point. So, um, but what I sometimes when I'd sleep, I would just hope that I wouldn't wake up. I hope that I would just die in my sleep. Just typical, just some of those things that you're struggling with, that depression, that, anxiety. And
Huh.
um, those were difficult times. And at night, I would just sit there and look at the stars. One of the things I would do, because obviously at night you can look at the stars, and I would think, is there some type of higher power in the universe? Is something there? Is there something greater than this little sphere we kind of, live on? Is there something important? Do I matter to this world? Does the world matter? This is of course, I was 16-year-old kid, so these kids have these existential thoughts anyway. But when you're sleeping in a car, you think that much more as a kid.
Oh, and they're exponentiated in the depth of the feeling of them, especially in the situation you were in.
Yeah, and so it was very difficult. So I one night I remember I was thinking, this life's really not very good. But then I just came to this realization that there is some higher power in the universe, and whether or not you're religious or not, but I think the idea of having this spirituality, the sense of a greater good, that you're connected to the universe, that you're not just a sole individual, that we're all interconnected.
Mhm.
This idea of kind of the spirituality, and that kind of feeling helped me to get through those difficult times. That there is some good or positivity in the world. And um, so with that, when I was 19, I actually went and served a religious mission in California, down in the barrios, the Latino parts in Southern California. Some of those neighborhoods are pretty rough. I actually saw a couple drive-by shootings firsthand, as in like 20 feet away, 50 feet away. Um, but the people in those areas, talk about interconnection. Those people, they're so humble and so pure, but they're so giving, so willing to share. They don't have much, but they're willing to share with others.
Mhm.
And they would give us their food. I mean, they didn't have much food, but they would invite us in for meals and have dinner with us, and just the kindness. And that changed my whole perception of the world. That I started to realize that there's a lot of good in the world, that there's a lot of positivity.
Right.
And because
Well, and they
before that,
also, if I may offer, they recognized you as a um, more of a stalwart individual because you were on a mission and you were recognizably so. If
yeah,
I'm
and it was,
if I'm
yeah,
hearing you
exactly.
correctly,
Yeah,
in the white
exactly. And we
shirt
would,
and tie and
yeah,
you know,
exactly, white shirt and tie. And we actually talked to gang members, they're about pretty close to our age. We'd go talk to them, and be in these rough neighborhoods where actually we have police officers stop and say, "Hey, do you guys know where you are? This is not
mhm,
like the best neighborhood for you to be in." We're like, "Oh yeah, we're okay." And because the people there they're just tremendous, the goodness, and it changed my perception from the victim mentality, which I'd been raised in, because I was raised and taught to be afraid of everything and everybody in the world. This fear that everybody was out to get you, that there's no good in the world. That's what I was raised as. But
hmm.
this experience changed me in the fact that then I was able to say, okay, yeah, they're actually really amazing, wonderful, great people in this
In
world. This world
places
can
that
be
you least expect it.
exactly, exactly. And those people, they live in these really very difficult, but there's still these amazing, wonderful people where you don't expect it. And it changed my whole perception on life. So I did a 180-degree flip, and I realized that there was so much good in this world, so much positivity, so much positive energy, that to try to focus on that to help me overcome, to be able to keep going, to go
Mhm.
back and go to college and go to medical school. And that just propelled me forward. It changed everything. And I think once we start to have that positivity in the world, we start to get some positive feedback or just send positive energy out in the world, that it affects not just us, but everybody around us.
Absolutely. Not to go metaphysical on you or anything, but there was a woman that I'd met that was trained in the Huna way, which is Hawaiian shamanism. And she was speaking at a church up in Prescott in about a 40-foot square room and hadn't been set up yet. I went early to talk with her because I was curious, and understanding that her workshop was about demonstrating the size of our aura in the past, present, and future, and how that affects us. Well, I was curious. I was like, okay, all this energy stuff. Well, she used dowsing rods, and she gave me a quick demonstration. She said, okay, I was standing in one corner of the room, and she said, I want you to go into the past, close your eyes and go into the past and just feel an event and go there with every ounce of your being. And I'm going to go over the other corner of the room, and I'm going to clear the rods. I'm going to walk towards you, and I'm going to stop where they open. I'm going to mark the spot. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to do something. We're going to look in the future and do the same thing. And then we're going to go into the present moment and show you the difference. So I was, okay. So bottom line, the past and the future opened up in almost the same spot, about 6 feet away. The present, she barely got 2 steps in from the other side of the room.
Interesting.
And it was a phenomenal realization that even when we don't meditate or we don't focus, we're not, really trying to be centered and present, that just that movement into it for a moment expands our energy that much more, and which makes us 2 things: more available to others, and that others can actually feel us too, and that we can change that environment simply by how we think and feel without saying a word.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, like I can tell when I walk in a room, you can walk, sometimes you can tell when you walk in a room, someone's just like very positive energy, positive, or you walk in and the opposite. You feel like it's just negative, like something's just, just like a vortex of negativity. And
Yeah,
it's
it's almost,
sucking.
in some places I felt like I got hit in the stomach with a sledgehammer. That was that forceful, I don't want to say ego because it's not a bad thing. It was that force of will and the pushing of the energy to do that we feel at that level, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I was a kid and growing up, that whole energy, my perspective on life changed 180 degrees.
Mhm.
And it helped me to be able to deal with those difficult times. And reading also, we talked about reading, but reading inspired me. When I was a kid, I would read books about these amazing people, even their fictional characters. For example, I love The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf and Aragorn were kind of my
Right.
heroes growing up. And so they overcame these insurmountable odds. Obviously, it's a fiction story, but it just kind of inspired me as a kid, saying, okay, here are these people, even people like Abraham Lincoln, who grew up in a log cabin, became president of the United States. These people kind of inspired me as a kid to be able to dream of something bigger, something larger. And though that also helped me, kind of inspired me to get.
Why do you think that we as a population, and I'm surmising this just based on what I think I see around me and the perceptions from that, what's keeping us from living larger in our own lives?
I think a lot of times it's us. I think we are sometimes our own. We keep ourselves back. We hold ourselves back a lot. I think we have this fear of. I think a lot of times we have this fear of failure, fear of putting ourselves out there, and so we don't. And by doing so, then we do fail. We set ourselves
Sure.
up to fail.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we're our own um, worst enemies. Basically, we hold ourselves back. Because I think you see these amazing people who achieved incredible things, like someone like Oprah Winfrey. She grew up incredibly poor, and now she's this multi-billionaire
Mhm.
person who's affected thousands and thousands of lives for a positive way because
Right.
she wasn't afraid. She kept taking those risks and kept moving forward.
Ted Turner's another one, didn't graduate, quit school at 8th grade, and then developed this huge network.
Yeah.
Fascinating people, yourself included, for 2 reasons. One, that first of all, you and I'm going to go out on a limb, you would choose to live this kind of life in order to learn what you did, right? And I'm not saying that that's a choice that you consciously made. However, it was one that you set yourself up before coming here to do in order to get where you are. The other is that learning process and the growth, the understanding, the connectedness. And you mentioned spirituality. This is that sense that we're all connected, right? And to be able to come from that place, and the experience that you had sounds like it really anchored that at least next level of experience of it in your life. So where did that take you from there? How did you bring that into your own experience, and after you served your mission, and where did you go with that?
So after I served my mission, I came back. So before my mission, I actually had a scholarship, but then I lost my scholarship my first year of college because I was working full time. I took like 17, 18 credits a semester, which is really difficult to do. And I lost it by 0.05. So in order to maintain the scholarship, you had to have a 3.5 GPA. I ended up with a 3.45 GPA for the year. So I lost it just by that much.
Yeah.
So when I got back from school, I was like, so I became back with this renewed purpose, this renewed sense of energy. And I came back and I enrolled in school. This time I had to pay for it with grants and working and student loans. And and then I met my wife, right? Shortly after I got back, I met well, obviously she was my future wife at that time. So I met her, and and then I just felt complete. I felt like part of me, once I met my wife and started having a relationship, I felt like I had somebody who could love me unconditionally for me, to be able to fill that emptiness that I always had in my heart.
Isn't that a great feeling? And it's unfortunate that it seems rare that that kind of combination, and at least from what I'm seeing, that in adults, there's that reticence to be really fully intimate and vulnerable with each other. And you can sense that there was a withholding of energy that could be present that isn't.
Yes, I completely agree. And the idea of being vulnerable and being kind of sharing who you truly are, your struggles, that's
That's a
difficult to do.
scary
And
thing to do,
it is very scary.
right?
It is, because then you strip away all the facade and you see you actually who you truly are, all your flaws and all your strengths, just who you are.
Sure.
But I think that's important to have that, though, in order to truly be connected with somebody or people in general.
You would be inauthentic if you didn't, right? There's this authenticity of being raw and real, however that is. You have to be able to love yourself enough to be able to experience that and not push it away. As you, there's an interesting thing that I found, and probably one of the reasons why I was led into the church for a while is I had an experience as a teen that was very similar to Mr. Smith's, and that's not for the Matrix, Mr. Smith. Although it could be. So what I found through that, I actually prayed to know what truth was. I was willing to die for it. I was in my first year of college, and it was just distraught, kind of like you were, and just wanted to know. And I want to know truth. I was willing to die for it if necessary. Why not? Right? Isn't it worth dying for? And of course, afterwards, there was this understanding that, there really is no death, and that we're all this infinite intelligence condensed into form in our individuated ways with a purpose once we're willing to start asking what that is. Most of us, then let me ask this, did you feel like you were moved by others to do what you're doing, or was it an internal direction, force, inspiration that you had to do so?
I think it was a combination of both, but I did definitely have this internal inspiration or guidance. When I look at my life, the odds of this are so stratospheric that I would go from sleeping in a truck to being a physician at Johns Hopkins are so stratospherically high that there's no way possible that that happened randomly. It's my own my own
Many
gestalt.
serendipitous and synchronistic moments in that.
Exactly. Exactly. There are many, many, many small moments that added together to create this thing, and many small choices and work along the way
Now
in
that's an
combination with it
interesting
too.
point right there that you just made, and pardon me for interrupting, but this is really serious. The many small choices, right? That some schools of thought think that, you know, you have to make this big grandiose choice and then everything else falls into it. And yes, from that perspective of, you know, have the end in mind first and then back it up, right? That's the standard business entrepreneurial philosophy. And yet there's this other part of you that's what you're seeking is seeking you too. And there's an openness, a vulnerability, and the ability to be curious as to what that might be that then seems to kind of nudge us in the right direction when we are paying attention.
Yes, exactly. And I one so a couple things I did when I was a kid. I did bungee jumping just for fun, just tried it, and I think that's kind of a lot like life. You know, when you're up on this little platform and you're looking down, you know there's this little rope that's holding you, and you have to trust in that rope that as soon as you lean over and let go, it's out of your control. But you have to make the effort to lean forward and let go, and then that rope pulls you back up and propels you forward. And I think
So
that's
what's it
like
like at the
life.
bottom of that when
Oh,
right before you're
so
pulled back out?
so
What's that
right before
sensation
you right before you're pulled back your first time, you're thinking, oh my, what am I doing? What did I just do?
like?
You know, am I gonna hit on the ground and just, you know, your life flashes before your eyes. But then the moment that that rope catches and you start to be lifted back up, it's an ecstatic feeling. It's like you're floating on a cloud. It's like you just kind of hit and then you're just floating back up, and it's just such an amazing, wonderful feeling. And that's why I think people do that. They have that mix of adrenaline of the fight and flight, you know, while they're falling, and then this lifting experience.
Now, do you feel or do you believe that that sensation, because once we experience something, we got a file, right? There's a file
Yeah.
that contains it. Do you believe that we can call that file up um, by choice and re-experience that as in place of, for instance, something that we're going through where that situation just kind of wipes us out and puts us in that depressive mode? Is there a potential for making a choice and tying into that sensation to bring it present?
I think there absolutely is. I think those experiences create emotional memories, not
Mhm.
just not just physical, but emotional memories. Our bodies have this emotional memory, and when we think back of our experiences, when we think back experience we went through, we often recall the emotion associated with that experience.
Hmm.
And I think at times when we're struggling, we can bring back some of those positive emotions to kind of give some positive energy. But I also think that sometimes we also have triggers sometimes that put us back into the negative emotional memories of our lives.
Sure.
And being able to filter that out and kind of come back to the present, kind of partially with mindfulness. I think that's one thing with mindfulness that does. And actually, that's one thing I actually started doing over the past 5 to 10 years is practicing this mindfulness and being able to focus on the present and letting all that stuff go
Mhm.
was very helpful. Being able to kind of filter those emotions, bring back the positive ones, like you said, recall the positive and try to let the negative ones just pass through me and go back, you know, just go on.
Sure. Now you mentioned mindfulness. Is this a practice of being more quiet and still in the moment and just observing what's happening and not being engaged by it, and then being able to kind of hit the pause button and it's like choosing how you want to engage it, if you
I
even.
think, yeah, I think that's part of it, but also I think just taking time daily to be present. Like I try to take time like at least 5 minutes a day, kind of just sitting down quietly and just thinking, okay, what am I feeling? What am I smelling? What am I hearing? You know,
Mhm.
what am I tasting? Just taking a moment to be present, mindfulness, and letting whatever thoughts come in my mind come and go, kind of like watching cars pass along your freeway. Kind of because I think the thing people mess up like with mindfulness and meditation is they want to try to control their thoughts. But in reality, you just kind of have to relax and just let the things come, let it
Well,
come
the
and
more you
go.
try to control, the more you're going to, the more you fight, the more you resist, the more it persists. We all know this, right?
Yeah,
So the
exactly.
practice of it, it's like, gosh, why do we do that? Well, I don't know, but we do. And we do. So how does this how would it be able to then help one to transcend the agony of moments in being or feeling stifled by anything?
Yeah, so perfect. Yeah, so for me growing up, I had a lot of traumatic experiences. We were evicted so many times I can't even count, at least 20 plus 25 times.
Mhm.
And and usually the police or whomever would come, put the thing on the door and evict us out of the house, or the landlord or whatever. So um one of the triggers for me growing up was when I would see a siren or police, I would have like almost like a panic attack. I would have this anxiety, just because this emotional memory was there
Sure.
versus nothing was happening in the moment, completely, nothing positive, just like even like an ambulance driving past on the road, whatever it was just kind of had this emotional memory. And so what I learned to do is kind of filter that, say, okay, yes, those things happened in the past, but nothing's happening now. Everything's fine now. The idea of being able to focus on the present, who I am, and just letting that go, letting that emotion go. And you talked about how men, we bottle these things up. And as men, one thing we have to learn to do is those emotions from the past, emotional memories, is we need to uncover those and face them and let them go. Because if we don't, they'll they'll still be there.
Well,
We never.
and an empathic and understanding wife certainly helps that process, right? Because we carry
Exactly.
that stuff, and I've noticed it in my own relationship that there were things that that would come up. Of course, we had different cultures that we were brought up in, which was in and of itself an interesting amalgamation of thoughts and feelings and beliefs and things of that nature. And then there was this ability to just look at ourselves and not be afraid that we would be rejected, regardless. And some stuff comes out, it can get pretty ugly because you're processing the emotions in the moment, and that often, especially if they've been stuffed for a while, it's going to come out and not feel too good to anybody,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
yet there's that unconditional or the understanding that, yeah, this isn't about me or about you. This is about the process and the trigger that's being examined, I guess, in
Yeah.
that moment and worked through, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, in my book, I kind of talk about wounds and scars. So,
Hmm.
we all go through this life. We all end up with wounds. We all end up with emotional, physical, mental wounds as we go through life. That's just part of it. You can't avoid it. And but once we kind of confront those wounds and we're able to work through them, then they become scars. Scars that are strong, that can be like strong, that can help strengthen us through those future difficult times and help others. And
Hmm.
and as we share our own scars, our own wounds with others and lift them, then our scars almost become like a badge of honor. These things that we overcame these demons, or these things that we overcame, that we can help others then overcome their own difficulties. And by sharing, the past becomes a lot less painful, then it actually kind of has a purpose. Gets a purpose. Those experiences we've gone through, we can have a purpose in sharing them with others to help them work through their own experiences. And
Hmm.
it kind of keeps us interconnected, like we're talking about. As we share and become vulnerable, we're able to connect with others and be able to help them work through whatever difficulties they're going through.
And do you find that in doing so, that energy, because there's attachment to that, even though we work on letting it go, there over time, there's still minor attachments to it that do flare up. And do you find that in the process of talking about it and discussing, with others to help them, that it also is more of a release of that energy within you too, and gives
Oh,
the opportunity to view it and assess and grow with and use as a teaching tool, perhaps?
absolutely, absolutely. I actually one thing I do now is I actually speak at fundraisers to raise money for homelessness, to raise awareness of homelessness.
Hmm.
And when I share these fundraisers, like I just spoke a couple weekends ago, the Palm Beach Mayor's Ball, which is in Palm Beach County, Florida, for the Homeless Coalition in Palm Beach County. And I spoke and kind of shared my experiences growing up. Afterwards, I had several people go up and say, "Thank you so much. You brought back some memories I had that I went through as a kid, and it really touched me and helped me to kind of see things in a different perspective." And my older siblings, as my book has been coming out, I shared with some of them, and they read it, and they're like, "Thank you so much. We've never ever talked about this growing up. We never talked about our lives growing up." And I was able to sit down and talk to my older brother and sister, as you know, kind of. And he said, my older brother said, "This is so therapeutic to be able to just talk about this, to get it out, you know, and to have that connection with him, that shared emotion." And it really helped him, just talking about it helped me, and at the same time, as we talked about it, it helped me. And you talked about writing is cathartic. Writing this book, processing all those emotions, sharing them with everybody, being vulnerable, because you know, in my book, there are some pretty vulnerable moments that I share with the world,
Mhm.
and being able to you know, I'm putting it out there just so I can help everybody else. And as I did that, those experiences, you know, the release happens. You're not afraid anymore. That fear that you hold back kind of goes away, and you kind of walk through it, and you realize it's going to be okay.
Mhm. And it is. Now, one of the things that came to mind as you were talking about that, you know, there's uh, a variance of perception and how we're received by others. For instance, we were talking earlier about the college experiences and what we went through and my awakening or the experience that I had. And after I had it, of course, my parents, I told them about it. I was pretty open and vocal because I thought it was pretty cool, but I wasn't looking at it from a place of mental disturbance, right? I wasn't trying to categorize or label it on a DSM level of any,
Yeah.
right? Because it was real, and it felt semi-normal, I guess. It's just part of the process, and I wasn't wacky over it. I was just trying to figure it out and understand it. So the psychiatrist they sent me to after a few visits said, you know, you're not crazy. You've had a spiritual awakening. Why so young? Don't understand it. Most people don't go through it till the mid 40s, if they ever do. And then explained that, you know, with what I knew or understood, that I better not talk to others about it because there would be no understanding, let alone listening to it. And I'm a big mouth, so I didn't pay attention. The following year, I got accosted at a frat house one night looking for a warm spot, and ended up in the hospital, and my parents decided to commit me. And they were concerned because I was on the edge. I made a stupid decision. I bought a couple of sets of drums and put them in my dorm room, spent half my room and board money, which meant I had to move out during the winter break. And I was too full of myself to tell them. So, right? And so I thought I would be able to make it, you know, make it through and fine. And I did in some way. However, um, when dad came to pick, you know, I thought he was coming to pick me up, and he said, no, I think you need to stay. And I think, okay, blow to the head, possible concussion, overnight observation. Yeah, I'm cool with that. Then a couple of orderlies walk up, take me onto the elevator, escort me up to the 7th floor. Door opens up. There's a huge black guy with a lot of keys on his belt that stands up from a chair and says, oh, got another one for me, huh? And at that point, I realized what was happening. Now, what happened was that in my discussions with the hospital psychologist, he was very clinical and labeled me from the DSM-4 at the time as a manic depressive paranoid schizophrenic and put me on 2,000 micrograms of Thorazine a day. And so that's the complete opposite of what ought to have happened, and not, you know, trying to understand the individual instead of treat it as a disease or a syndrome or you know, trying to put them in a box again, which is how it felt. And yet I was so vehement in my own experience that the Thorazine had no effect. I was up playing ping pong and beating the male nurses. I should not have been able to do that,
Yeah,
right?
not with that much stores. Yeah, oh, yeah.
Right, right. And so they didn't understand what was going. I didn't know any better, right? I didn't know the effect it was supposed to have. What it did teach me, though, is to stick to my truth. Even though afterwards I would shake on the inside so bad that my body would tremble in talking about things with others because I was scared to death of being put back in an institution. And it's funny that, gosh, I think my dad was 80 when he finally shared this with me. He says, you know, he called me Brucey still, which is my given name. And he says, you know, I was really afraid that when you moved to Phoenix that you would say something in the wrong place and they would take you away. And I said, well, Dad, I've been there for 35 years. I think I made it. So, and evidently the screen did too. That was a nice little
Exactly. Little
flash.
touch.
Right? Now, that's interesting. Was that specifically timed? Were the friendlies apparent, or, was it just a glitch? Who knows?
Yeah.
Interesting timing. However, those kinds of things are evidence of how we do not pay attention to the individual and ask them questions. We assume certain things and then treat them accordingly.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't listen with the intent to listen. We listen with some other motive, such as to advise or whatever. We don't just listen to understand. And listening and understand, I think, is a great skill, and it's a difficult skill to just be in the presence and listen to someone and try to truly understand their perspective and their point of view.
It's a discipline, because you want to, we want to speak, especially when something, it's like loose association, right? For folks on the spectrum, if you will, that there are these triggers. You hear something and you automatically got to respond, right? There's just no controlling it. And yet in that place, you learn how to discipline yourself to just be quiet and still and wait for a moment that then appears for you to speak. And that's the interesting thing about it. It's like, what is the third insight in James Redfield's Celestine Prophecy? I don't know if you ever read that or not. It speaks to that listening and not speaking until you feel it well up from within you. And that's a
Yeah,
much different feeling than coming from here.
exactly. Yes, listening to understand, listening to emotionally connect with someone, to truly try to feel what they're feeling. That's what one thing my wife's kind of taught me, this empathic, these skills, and I'm getting better at it. Obviously, I'm not as good as she is, but I'm getting better at learning to just listen and try to understand and feel what the person I'm talking to is feeling. You
And
know.
now we have a word for that, or two words actually: emotional intelligence. And it applies in relationships as well as corporate environments now. And that is a huge growth in how we at least understand the impact of it, not necessarily what we do about it, because we're still struggling in how to be in that place with each other. Do you find that to be true?
Oh yes, absolutely. And I find also, as you share and have the emotional connection, you almost feel like friends or family. When you talk to these people and you have this emotional connection, you feel this inner, like we talked about, the interconnection of the universe. You feel connected in some ways or another. And I think people have used that connection, emotional intelligence, for good and for bad. If you look in history, people have used it to manipulate others, but also other people use it to lift others and create, positivity. Somebody, for example, like Gandhi, who used that kind of positivity to inspire, change in his country for the good. Then you
Sure.
have other people in history who did the opposite. I don't really talk about them, um, but so that emotional connection and just feeling with people can be a very powerful force for good and the opposite.
Do you see the world coming out of COVID, speaking of positive change for the world, it was hoped for, a belief, maybe in a possibility in the beginning. I know when we went on lockdown here, I turned to my wife and I said that, I really hope that this obsession on self-hygiene and sequestration would get people to turn inward and questioning who they are, right? And getting closer to themselves. And that then was hoped that would create a wave of change coming out of it that gives us a more empowered, conversant, connected world. And of course, that's going to take some time. Do you see that as a silver lining coming out of COVID?
I think, yes, for some people, I think it is a silver lining. I think for other people, they actually became more disconnected. Unfortunately, they turned to other ways to pass the time, like Netflix or whatever, kind of more the impersonal type way. And I think, but I have found a lot of people actually did. There are quite a few people now. I think we have this connection now, because now I think people would use Zoom and things like that to talk to people, and all these new technologies that help people to remain connected. I think is a positive way to connect, not just such as like the YouTube videos, but actually connect, like such as a Zoom video call or things.
Right.
I think that
Kind of like what
technology,
we're doing here,
exactly,
we're getting
exactly,
into some deep areas that few explore. And I think it's more important to explore this real raw reality that we're not quite sure about, and yet have some ideas that have an open environment in order to share and speculate and maybe even have an apocalyptic moment where an aha happens and this knowledge that's been there the entire time suddenly comes to the surface, because that's really what the name or what the word apocalypse means. It's uncovering. It's not the end of the world.
Yes.
Uh,
And actually, for you mentioned that, for me, that actually happened probably 8, 10 years ago. I was struggling with some just my past, kind of working through it and just struggling and feeling a lot of kind of anxiety and stuff. And then my wife one night came to me and said, "Hey, have you ever read the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for and so she said, "I think you should read this." And I started reading, and I read the idea that um, basically, as you learn to deal with your past and share it, it becomes less painful. And
mhm.
kind of the idea that, and that was kind of my aha apocalyptic moment, you could say, just kind of like realization that, I needed to kind of work through this and start to share with people, kind of these feelings and emotions to help them, not just for me, but to help them to share it out there. And that was part of the reason why at that point, that's when I kind of started working my book, kind of revisit the past and go through that. And that was kind of my
There's two
aha
different
moment.
ways of doing that, at least, right? There's the sharing in order to be helpful, understanding, connect with another. And then there's the victim that likes to play on the emotions and things like that. This is one of the things that I think it is important that we get to that place where we recognize that we have the choice and have made those choices for every experience that we've had. And it's time that we take responsibility and accountability for that. Only when we do that, that's where the self-love really begins, in embracing who we are without condition and just saying, okay, this is what I did. And these were, understanding. That's where the unpacking, the catharsis comes, easy for me to say, in the writing as you're processing, which few of us actually do. There's the journaling notion that, there was so much about that not that long ago, as far as the opportunity to process things through journaling and being able to grow from that. In the process of writing your book, did you do a lot of journaling in those years in college and post-college before taking on the writing?
I would do it intermittently. I wish I would have done it more.
What kinds of
I
things did you write about? What was most important to jot down in those moments, do you think?
when I was a kid, I think I tend to intellectualize things, so I couldn't deal with the emotion. And so when I wrote, I kind of just wrote events and things that were happening. Um, but when I wrote events, those emotions, see, I have a very good memory, and so those emotions and memories are still there. And so once I start thinking about the events, then the emotions come back. Once you those events that I wrote about, things happening, not just so then I remember the feelings, not just the event, but the feelings associated with that. And I think that's helpful. Why journaling? Journaling is a great tool, as it helps us to put words to our feelings and our emotions. It helps us to understand them.
Therapeutic too, with a major degree. It's the choice to be able to, carve out the time and actually do it. Um, are
And
there other things that you had something to
so,
say? Go ahead.
yeah, your idea of accountability and choice and choosing. That's one thing that I realized. Like I said on my mission, that we had power to choose. That I wasn't a victim. That the world was not controlling me, but I could make choices. I may not be able to choose my circumstances where I start, but I could make choices that then change my future circumstances. That I was
Absolutely.
empowered to do that.
Now, how do you recommend that that is found inside and developed? How do we access that? How do we um, get a framework to apply that in? Because again, we're not necessarily taught about how to process and engage and feel all these things and be able to articulate that process too.
Yeah, it can be difficult because I said that we're afraid. See, I think we're afraid of being accountable, saying, yes, I made that choice. It was a bad choice. We have to be accountable to ourselves and be honest. I think things we have to be honest with ourselves, and accept ourselves. Yes, you made a choice, bad choice then, but you don't have to make that choice again. You can change that choice and make a different choice in the future.
Mhm.
And the idea that I think it starts with just small choices, realizing when I wake up, I can choose to go to work and do what I need to do, and or I can try to, I can do the opposite and not do what I'm supposed to do. But we have to realize just those little small choices each day then start to change that whole mindset that
Mhm.
we make those small choices that we are empowered.
Now, in that empowered place, when you're in process of making that choice, I assert that there's a certain sense, there's a knowing, there's a this is the right thing to do, right? That's unquestionable. And
Yeah,
yet,
the inner
we often don't do that.
exactly. I think we all have that inner voice or that conscience, you could say, that kind of tells
Right.
us, this is a good thing to do, this is a bad thing to do. And sometimes we do the good thing, sometimes we don't. And I think learning to listen to that voice and being there and say, okay, how does this make me feel what I'm doing? Is this making me feel better, meaning in a positive way versus a negative way?
Mhm.
And being honest with ourselves, saying, yes, you can make this choice, but it's entirely up to you. You have the agency to choose. And it's those little choices that add up over years to where we end up in our
Right.
future.
One of the things I look for is the common threads throughout all of the schools of thought, religions, things of that nature. And one of the things I had the wonderful opportunity of getting to know a gentleman named Kai D. And if you don't recognize the name, he was the original WOFAT on Hawaii 5-0 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And he actually had a doctorate in theology and was the rector for Taoist Sanctuary here in Tempe, Arizona. He was one of my early interviews on the show that I did in the early 90s called One World, which is kind of where this came off a 30-year hiatus to do this. He had said to me during an interview that, in their way, the Taoist way, things are either desirable or undesirable. And that's at a very base feeling level. How can we, what do you recommend, or how can we pay more attention to that, bring it up in ourselves, act upon that in the positive way, and talk about the process? Because this is where the next level of catharsis comes, in my opinion, is that as we share these things in a more communal way, then that affects the larger perspective, the larger population as well, because we're being more free and open and transparent and loving in the process. Gosh, imagine that, more loving. Whew.
Yeah, and I think we also learn to have self-love.
Yeah.
Um, I think many people with their lives, they don't love themselves. They're actually very judgmental and harsh on on themselves, more so than the world
Well,
is
you
on
can
them.
imagine what an adoptee, okay, once an orphan at birth, adoptee, you find out very young you're adopted. What's the first thing you're going to think about? How self-deprecating you can be towards yourself because somebody else didn't want you. Your mother and father did not want you. That's what a little child thinks.
Yeah.
And so some of those kinds of things take decades to get over because you don't even realize that that's where your baseline emotions are. Is this, abandonment, rejection. And so you create it in your life.
Yeah,
You
and
go, wait a minute, something's not right here. And you realize, oh, okay, it's about me. It's not about anybody else.
yeah, and you think about a good point is when you're going through that, you have to realize that you're accountable. You're accountable for your choices, how
Mhm.
those choices affect others, whether they're good or negative. You still are accountable for those choices. You're accountable for your actions
Now,
and
even in
how
those
they.
environments, sorry to interrupt, even because I had a really wonderful childhood, just exquisite. And yet there were still those patterns because of that emotional detachment early on that I couldn't process until much later. But
Yeah,
that
and that emotion.
never a question about the unconditional love my parents had.
Yeah, and that emotional detachment is kind of how I wasn't adopted, obviously, but you kind of pack those emotions away in a box and stick them somewhere, and you don't confront them for 10, 20, 30 years, but eventually, once you open that box, you kind of work through it, you realize you come to an understanding a lot more so of those emotions and feelings of the past, and you can leave it behind.
And
That's the thing is,
do you find it produces, in leaving it behind, do you find that it produces a sense of fearlessness?
you do, yeah. I think the fear goes away a lot more so because then you realize, yes, I had those feelings, but that's still part of me, but that's okay. That's okay that I felt that angst or that anger as a teenager. I felt that, and that's okay. It's part of who I am. You don't have to run from it. I kind of like this idea of like you run from your past, but once you learn to embrace it, that's part of who you are. That's part of who you are too. You're not
Right.
this person today. You're from the past as well, and accepting yourself. And that's where I think kind of that self love, being okay. Yes, I have some issues. Kind of like the idea of the Japanese art where they fix pottery with gold. Broken pottery. Yes, I have those flaws, those that I was broken, but that's okay. That means that I've lived life, that I've overcome these difficult circumstances. And now I'm a beautiful pot with made out of, my fractures are made out of gold now, kind of like the old idea of the Japanese.
Right. Now, speaking of fractures, I'm going to jump into the quantum imaging, the work that you do. We're going to go a little different direction here and get a little more, perhaps. I mean, we've been talking, it's been a wonderful excursion into the spiritual, the connectedness, the processing, and the real and rawness that you've expressed. And I truly appreciate that. On more the science side of things, and I'm not sure, so this may be a question that doesn't belong. In the quantum imaging, are you looking, let me just ask you this, what do you look for in the quantum imaging? And are you beginning to look at other indicators as to what might be present in an individual that's out of alignment?
So with our group, we use imaging to obviously diagnose disease. I'm a diagnostic radiologist, and
Mhm.
also not just disease, but other things that are happening with people. And what's interesting in the field itself is you're starting to see more things called PET imaging, which is positron emission tomography,
Mhm.
and the MRI imaging, like a functional MRI imaging. And it's fascinating because functional MRI specifically, or PET, is what it is. For PET imaging, they actually administer certain radioactive material that gets taken up by certain parts of the brain. And as people go through certain things, or like, for example, Alzheimer's or dementia, they're starting to find areas of the brain that they didn't understand before, and kind of the functionality of these changes in the brain over time that people experience as they have disease. And then other things, though, like the function MRI is fascinating because they'll ask people questions and things like that in the MRI, and different parts of their brain light up, and kind of it's not really what they expect, and the patterns are really not what they expect. And there's so much fascinating activity that happens in the brain as they go through this.
What do you
And
think they have the expectations? Is there an idea that they presume how the brain functions, and so their expectations as to where they're going to see this firing taking
so,
place?
yeah, I think they're scientists, so they approach it scientifically. I mean, they have this theory, this hypothesis that this part of the brain must do this versus that based on the anatomy, but the physiology is not always the same as the anatomy. It's the way it works. And the interconnection, the brain has so many interconnected neurons that we're not even beginning to understand at the depths of how
Mhm.
how the brain functions, and not just the brain, but in connection with our own the eternal side of us, or the spiritual side of us, because we have our physical, but then we have the two are connected together.
Sure. And speaking of the two, let's go to the right and left hemispheres. What I find interesting that I don't see much about, yet there's indicators throughout the historical literature of the chakra system, in specific, the pineal and the hypothalamus, right, being two of those organs that are the third eye and the throat chakra, I think is what they're
Yeah.
associated with. Um, so what I find interesting, apparently, and correct me if I'm wrong, the pineal's at the top of the corpus callosum and the hypothalamus is at the bottom. And the corpus callosum is the membrane in between the two hemispheres.
That connects the two. Yeah.
Right. So this is where the two communicate through. Now, is it possible that when you have that energy flowing in more dynamic ways, you're open, you're looking for connectedness, you're maybe even thinking that the chakra system is somehow at play in your body, and you want to open that up to be more sensitive. Could it be that in doing so, that energy, the flow, then dissipates into both hemispheres through the corpus callosum, and then brings a maybe even a higher level of functionality in the world based on the connectedness?
Yeah, so I think when we're disconnected, I think as we're able to form those connections between our right and left, or between like the emotional and the intellectual side, and
Mhm.
bring those two together, I think we're much more of a complete person. And yeah, the corpus callosum acts as the highway in the brain between those, as far as we know, between
Right.
the parts of the brain. And as we're able to connect those two together, I think then you see amazing talents manifested. That's why I think some of our greatest works of music, I think they kind of bring those two together. Somebody like Beethoven or somebody like that, bring like the mathematical, of the symphony versus the emotion, kind of bring the two together.
And would you also say that that's kind of merging the masculine and feminine energy as well?
Yeah, I would imagine so. Somehow it's a bringing two together, kind of make us more of a complete full person rather than kind of fractured or dysfunction, kind of bringing us to,
So
yeah,
what so what I hear you saying, I think, is that below all of this, or these distractions we have, that there's actually a fully integrated being that we aren't necessarily all that aware of yet.
yeah, I think we are very much not as self-aware as we should be. And I think when we learn to become in tune to that spiritual side, or who we truly are, from the universe perspective, who we are as beings, that then we also start to live our lives differently. I think we try to live more positively and try to remember that connection with others. And I think that we limit ourselves. Plus, I think we're limited just being physically in the mortal world that we live in. That we live in this finite world, but the
Right.
universe is not finite. It's an infinite universe, and trying to understand the infinite from a finite perspective is difficult.
It's a
I
yeah, that's a great word, right? It is difficult. Now, what's interesting though is, again, comparing philosophies, religions, and things, looking for that golden thread. As we know, one of the I don't know if baseline philosophies, I guess, of the church, that is that we're gods and goddesses in embryo, right? And that fits to the old scriptural reference of we're sons and daughters of God. Okay, so what are we when we grow up? And this is a conversation and questions we don't necessarily ask all that much, because we are told that it's blasphemous and we should never do that. Well, why not? Right? If this is so, and we have this capacity, it goes back thousands of years in the Vedantic philosophy. That philosophy is based around this unity consciousness that we're all a part of, and individuated threads of as God incarnate. And that's 10, 15,000 years old. And we're just now coming to that understanding in modern religions. Seems kind of right. The last couple hundred years anyway. Um, Tremendous progress we've made.
yeah,
Right. So how do we, and you understand how congruent those two things are, right? There's a belief, there's a dogma of many religions that include that same philosophy. And yet when people start manifesting the example of it, they're ostracized. Why is that?
I think
Would you
part of
agree, first of all, and then what? Because I don't want to just make an assumption without.
no, no, I agree. I agree that we are definitely a higher purpose, and there's a God in the universe, and that God or goddess, as a heavenly father and heavenly mother.
I call it the
Basically, that.
thoughtmosphere, right? There's this infinite
Yeah.
intelligence that's this magnificent, unqualified thoughtmosphere, and our choices help to manifest whatever it is we need to experience.
Yes, and as we go through life and we realize that we're connected, that we have this higher purpose, I think it changes the way we live our lives. That we don't just try to live the day by day, but we try to do what, quote, the right thing. We talk about that in our conscience. We try to do the right thing, not just because it'll make our lives better, but just because it's the right thing to do, you
It,
know?
well, intrinsically, like we were talking earlier, there's that knowing, there's that conscience that's resident, that when we do the right thing, and even when nobody's looking, we know, we
Yeah.
know. How can we look in a mirror knowing and then feel comfortable about how we are? It would seem to me that that would really cause some major confusion internally, and and that quest that eventually leads to a place like you and I have experienced, where we come to a place that's so traumatic that we have to start questioning ourselves and letting go of what we assumed to be true.
Yes, and being honest with ourselves, that internal honesty is a very difficult thing for people to go through, to be truly honest with yourself. Say, I have issues, it's okay. I have these things. It's okay. That's who I am, but I can work through them and become even stronger after I go through these, experiences.
Mhm.
And become self-aware and be aware of how those, feelings and emotions affect us and those flaws, and try to then see what's the higher purpose in life? Why are we here? Is it just to make money or whatever, goods or whatever, or is it to try to leave the world a little bit better than
How
when we
about
came?
share a planet
Yes,
and learn how to work together to do so, so that we're all safe and secure?
exactly.
That, I
Rather than trying
believe,
to be
is
selfish, more selfless, try to.
what, right. It would seem, innocent bystander, right, observing things, it would seem that if there is this natural order in the universe that we see, and it's all working perfectly, right? There's no anomalies. For us to think there is an anomaly usually means we don't quite understand things well enough yet. And so, in being able to bring that understanding back to this natural evolutionary process, wouldn't it just make sense that this is part of this internal programming that's at the base of everyone, to love and be loved and learn how to work together in order for that to manifest fully? Is that
Yeah,
possible?
I think that every human being is born with that internal want to be able to love and to love others. And the idea that we're all born with that thing, and you're interesting, the thought of like we're gods in embryo. I think that that this mortal existence is just a pathway, a short-term school per se, to help us to grow, to become more selfless, to be better, as in to become more perfected with the universe, being able to coexist, like you said, on a planet, to share, to be able to be, in harmony, be able to be connect with people. It's a process that we grow through, and I think as we go through this life, it can either make us better that way, or we can become more bitter and more victimized. And we we progress, and through this school, I think this life's like a school here.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. And how do we all graduate with honors, right? That's the question, and help
That's
others
the
to
question.
do so as well. Because
Yeah.
it's, unless we do, then we're really not fully participating, because there is that self-driven, last century, precursive, right? It's almost a masculine energy of the drive to acquire that has devastated our planet and the people on it, because of the profit over people and planet agenda that's been present. Um, Not that it was a bad thing initially, however, it's grown to the point that where there hasn't really been good management of it. Now, how do we
Yeah, we're
fix that? What do you think we can do to help resolve this disparity, and learn how to work together more in the capacity that we're capable of?
I think the first thing has to start with us individually. It has to start with one person, meaning the one person we can most affect is ourselves.
Mhm.
And I think it'll start with us individually. And then once we try to make good decisions for ourselves that kind of are positive, then on a daily basis, working, just trying to make one positive, influence in the world on it, just trying to change as we change our little sphere of influence around us, and we try to, then that spreads, that energy, the positive energy spreads out across the world. Not
Mm.
just so one person then changes by the ripple effect, changes. If you pay it forward, meaning you do something nice for one person that day, then there's a chance they'll do something nice for somebody, or positive for something else. And as that spreads positively, rather than saying like the opposite, we spread negativity, as you said, kind of the selfishness versus selflessness.
So what
And
do you say to the materialist that doesn't believe in any of this and still wants to go after their own self-interests? What can we, you and I, because we're both in the same boat, I think, and it's rising with the tide, right? And how do we address that? How do we invite curiosity or exploration or questioning of the seeming reality that they're experiencing?
well, I think this materialism or consumerism is, they'll never be fulfilled. They'll never have that emptiness filled. You can buy as much stuff as you want, but you'll never have that empty place in your heart be filled, because goods and things like that never fill us completely. But as we um, try to do good or serve or share with others, I think then we actually feel. A good example is somebody like Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa, monetarily, temporally, she had very little, but she seemed to be one of the most happy, fulfilled persons to live, because she was
And what
out
an
trying to,
impact, right?
yeah,
What an
she
impact.
she impacted millions just by, this trying to do good and things, and trying to be selfless and help others, and not taking in. And because those people who seek for just materialism and goods and things like that, that will never fill that place that you can't, that place that's missing. It will never fill it. And I think one question I ask those people as they look for that, just ask, are you happy? Or do you feel fulfilled? You know, buying whatever, the Ferrari or the Lamborghini, whatever, does that fulfill you? It might for a short time, but then it loses its kind of luster, it loses its, brilliance, and then you have to look for something else and keep searching. They're searching and searching, and it will never fill that place until you learn to kind of leave that a little bit behind, I think, and start to serve others to kind of have that help, the connection to lift. And like I said, like Mother Teresa, I think for me is a perfect example.
Absolutely. And so what I hear you saying is that life becomes more cooperative and collaborative than competitive.
Exactly. Exactly. We rise above the whole idea of competition. Now, competition can be healthy in some ways. Obviously, it creates, innovation and things like that. It's great, but it can be taken to an excess. Everything can be taken too far.
Right.
And,
Right.
and
Not to win above all. Right. It's
exactly.
we've got to be, I like to call it a triple win: a win for you, a win for me, and a win for the planet. Because
Yeah.
those three, we are, whether we realize it or not, of the earth. Every single cell in our body comes from the earth.
Yeah. We're all carbon-based life forms. We're all,
Right. And well, in the food that we take in, this is what, where's it come from? Well, it comes from the earth in some way, shape, or form. So, and in other ways, what's the earth? Well, it's kind of collected stardust. And so are we then stardust? And, this is what Dr. Lazo kind of talks about, is there's this higher self that then from the Vedantic place permeates reality. And it's just our ability to acquiesce to this energy, this understanding, this connectedness that's deep within us. And apparently from recent scientific discoveries, there's a bridge between the inner and the outer worlds, which we live half inside and half outside. Most of it we're kind of bereft of the inner, which is what we're talking about, and why we're talking about it is to help bolster that understanding and willingness to be vulnerable and explore it without so much fear, right? So in that ultimate coming up, there's a genetic as well as a vibrational coherence in our bodies of the coding and the frequency and that conscience that is active and guiding us toward something, right? And that being individuated, it's going to be different for everybody. We're like snowflakes, all right? However, the hierarchical structure, for lack of a better, is meant to work in harmony. So why not ask questions about it from a place of exploring how it might be in harmony already, and then emulating that as humans? This is something that, do you feel that this is, that you're seeing this beginning to happen, and that what you've discovered from your medical training and the exploration of consciousness in that, as well as your religious studies, does this seem to edify the growth of humanity in some respects?
I think it does. And I think a lot of times people think science and religion are opposed, but in reality, they're both seeking truth. They're both seeking the truth. And I think if we start to kind of marriage the two together, that science and religion are not necessarily opposed, they can be synergistic. They can come together and understand the world better.
And I
You
would
don't
think
have to
if they
necessarily,
don't prove each other, then they're both questionable.
exactly. And then they should prove each other's together. They should come together and create understanding of the universe, because neither, it's like, are cohesive. They don't necessarily have to be competitive. They can be cohesive and work together. And as we start to kind of approach science with some type of spirituality with it, I think our understanding grows better, because one example I think of, like Chinese medicine. I've been learning a little more about Chinese medicine and kind of things like that. And
Fascinating. The
it
Daytunes
is.
and the
It
meridians.
is meridians and acupuncture and all these things, and
Right.
kind of the herbs and things like that. You talk about coming from the earth. Some of the Chinese medicines actually work very well. Just herbs and things like that from the earth. And the idea that, and that doesn't oppose modern American medicine either. I mean, there's no reason why we can't use the two together to create the strengths of both.
Oh, Big
And
Pharma wouldn't like that, though, right?
yeah, there is a
And that's, that's the elephant in the room, right? It's about making money. It's not about health. It's about disease and just creating it, the symptoms and the cures, or well, you know what I mean. There's this prescriptive quality that we have about life, that, oh, that you're feeling that way, well, take this, right?
yeah,
That's somehow going to be good.
yeah, and I think they both have strengths. Obviously some of the medication stuff like that are very light,
Absolutely
and
agree with that. However,
and and then putting the two together, the idea of sometimes profit, is, as we all know, sometimes profit over patients is not. It's obviously not a good thing,
well,
and
and we've
um,
created a nation of addicts with the oxycodone epidemic and things like that.
yeah, and instead of, I think, as people use other things like massage therapy and things like that to deal with their chronic pain, they're much better served, and there's not a risk of addiction or things like that. As we, um, it's the whole the opioid addiction is a terrible epidemic right now in the U.S. that
And
we have all these
unfortunately, insurance doesn't cover massage or many alternative health therapies and things of that nature, which is kind of odd and very telling of how the two industries could be working together. I'm not
yeah.
saying they do, right? But
But
there's,
they could be, yes. Yeah, I go to massage therapy myself, and I found it's been incredibly. I had some carpal tunnel symptoms in my arms from, my job, and doing massage therapy really has helped me, that I didn't have to have surgery, really got me through that, and helped kind of some of these issues like that. And, other therapies like acupuncture, my wife does acupuncture now, and it's been very helpful for a lot of, things that she's been, going through. Just these other ideas that there's good reason. There's a reason why Chinese medicine's been around for thousands of years. They've worked on these things too.
right.
And
And those needles are not just to go in specific places. They're actually using your body's own electromagnetic field to feed you the energy back where it needs to be in order to open the flow up. That's what I find so fascinating, right?
yeah,
5,000 years old or thereabouts, this kind of, what would I call it? psychospiritual technology, maybe?
Yeah, the idea that we're not just organic beings, that we actually have this energy or spiritual side too, I think is
Hmm.
we try to explore that more and realize that we're not just carbon-based life forms, but we're something higher to us. There's
Oh,
something
and
more to us.
what was fascinating to me in my conversation with Dr. Laszlo is coming from, perspective of quantum physics and the at least awareness that we're 99% space and 1% material. And when I mentioned that, Dr. Laszlo said, I would offer that we are 100% energy. Because now, from a quantum perspective, there is no physicality. There's vibrating swigglies, right, that come together to manifest everything. And depending on our own perception or our belief or our awareness or our projection of what we anticipate a world to look like based on what we've experienced so far, right? We get programmed to anticipate or expect certain things. What happens when that gets shattered and that we have an experience that shows that, oh, things are really super connected and so much so that we can't fathom just how much so until this inexplicable event happens that edifies that particular
Yeah.
perspective, right? What have you had in your life that's done that? Because I know you have.
So I have, yeah. So when my father passed away in 2006, and he was in Utah and I was in Pennsylvania, Maryland, so
Mhm.
2,000 miles away, literally 2,000 miles separation in space. But when he passed away that night, I woke up from my sleep and I knew that he was gone. And literally 15 seconds later, my mom called on the phone. My mother called to tell me that he'd passed away, or 30 seconds later. But I just had this connection that I knew that he was gone, even though I was 2,000 miles away from him. I can't explain it, physically or but I just knew that I had this connection that he was gone. He passed from this world,
Mhm.
and it's an experience like that that kind of you realize there's a lot more than we even comprehend of how we're connected with, especially family and friends, and how we are connected, and that I can't explain it. I just know that I woke up and I knew he was gone. I just knew. It's I don't know how to explain it, but you know,
I know it's hard to explain, and because there's so many integrated features in how the two of you, one being the bloodline, the frequency, all of those, really finely discerning instances in the differences, slight deviance or slight difference rather than deviance in your physical frequency, right, and your bloodline, right? So you're connected. It's like the cultural memories that we have from our distant relatives are still present in our physical forms because of that genetic engineering factor, right? That we carry those, and then we wonder in some cases why certain patterns show up as triggers. Are they personal or are they historic,
yeah, they
right?
could be both.
Uh,
Yeah,
exactly. So, and these are some of the things that we don't necessarily consider, especially when we're dealing with stuff and we've got the more materialistic mindset about it. Right? It's got to be something wrong with me. Well, what if it's just something right with you that you haven't fully understood yet?
yeah,
Speaking of being something right, we've probably coming up close to our allotted time. And I'm so appreciative of this conversation. It's been wonderful. What kind of offering, is there something that you would like to share with the audience or a tasty tidbit of a daily practice that you might suggest for them to explore and find out about this difference for themselves?
yeah. So one thing I do now, I live in Florida by the beach, and so on a daily basis, my wife and I try to go and walk along the sand on the beach and be connected with the world, and just feel the energy of the ocean and the breeze, and touch the sand with our feet and kind of being grounded in the earth. And I think to take a daily, just on a daily basis, try to go outside and explore and just be connected with the world. Take your shoes off, touch the ground, feel the ground, just be connected to realize that we're all part of this world together. That um, just just 5-10 minutes a day, just go outside and just be a part of the world, be connected, feel the sunlight, feel the rain, feel the air, and just be here, part of the world, and realize that we're all part of this world together. I think as we do that, we'll realize that, that's okay. That person cut me off in traffic. I can let it go.
Right,
It's
right.
just maybe they have some reason. We learn to let these things go more. Just to kind of be that we're all here together. That we're all here on this planet together, and we're all connected.
And doesn't matter what your profession is, the earth's the same.
Yeah. I can walk along the beach here in Florida or walk along the beach in Hawaii. It's the same thing.
Yeah, well, here in Arizona, there's no ocean, just
That's
beach.
just the sand. But
Right. Oh, well, Chris, I really thank you for this conversation. I know, having gone through some of the similar things that you have, there's a wonderful vulnerability that you have to be able to talk about this. And I appreciate that. And I'm
yes,
sure
well,
our
thank you.
audience does as well. And hopefully they will, take some nuggets and apply them to themselves and grow accordingly.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this deep conversation. It's been fabulous. It's been fascinating. So
For me too. And thank you so much again, Chris. And namaste and in lak'ech. And thank you for sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and I'll see you next time.